Irrational Radio.
Create something.
Today I'll be talking about a little bit of philosophy and Dungeons and Dragons. Both of those things together. It's kind of what I normally talk about, but I think I'm going to put a little bit different spin on it this week. So, the topic of this lecture is called Philosophy and the Dungeon. And what I kind of wanted to do with this lecture here is to really hammer home my belief that role playing is a form of literature in the same way that like books and movies and TV or forms of literature as well. And I think that it's a relatively unexplored form of literature that is just ripe for some interesting thoughts and comparisons and some literary analysis that I think would be very fruitful, especially, given that no one has really explored it before. I mean, people have been talking about books, like literature as novels and stuff for a long, long time, hundreds and hundreds of years. And, just within the last 150 has film started to be talked about. Why you can take college classes now that talk all about film. And you can spend 8, 9, 10 years studying film as a practice. And it just maybe even more recently, things like television and even like serialized YouTube has been subject to literary analysis. In fact, memes, like the top text, bottom text memes have become have gone under the knife of literary analysis. You can take college level classes right now discussing memes. It's going to continue being studied because it is a form of communication, and it's a mass form of communication too. I mean, we study in the literary circles. We study other languages that are only spoken by hundreds, if not thousands, if not only a few dozen people. And memes are a form of communication that is shared by millions and millions. It's another form of communication, spreading one idea to another person via writing or pictures. And so I wanted to kind of turn that critical literary eye upon role playing. And I want to show in this lecture that not only is role playing or the act of telling a story through a large group of people, not only is that something that's brand new, or is sort of brand new and sort of not brand new. I'll discuss that more, but sort of like a brand new sphere for telling stories that might not be possible through other mediums. And I know I've discussed this in previous lectures, but I really, in this last week, I've been researching some philosophical ideas, modern philosophical ideas from, the 80s and 90s that I think I can apply to the art of philosophy or the art of Dungeons and Dragons and role playing, not only through the relationship between the DM and the role players, but the role players to the story that they're helping tell as the DM. Without further ado, let's just jump right into it. So, I kind of started thinking about this there was a conversation on the Discord server about do you think that we'll ever run out of stories? Do you think that there'll be a moment where the last story has been told and there is no more new storylines to be told? Maybe given an infinite amount of time, would this be the case? Maybe, stretched out over a very, very long period of time. Maybe every single combination of every single word could be come up with and then discovered that there is absolutely nothing new. Uh, or is it infinite? Or are the stories that humans tell or the stories that we roleplay in, are they infinite? Is there a never-ending amount of them? There's a couple of camps that exist in the sphere of these two, there are a couple of ideas that exist in the sphere between these two camps. And one is the one that I hold to is that no, we will never run out of stories. And the reason that I think this goes into some epistemological studies focusing most mostly on deconstruction theory, and the idea that through the difference in both the meanings of words and how they're used within a piece of writing determines the meaning of the text, and it has nothing to do with either the author's intent or the structural words themselves. And this in itself means there'll be no lack of stories to tell. There will always be something else to be said because every time you use a word, you are not, the word doesn't signify, or the word isn't the thing that it's signifying. When I say dog, the word dog is not a dog. The word dog is a collection of symbols, sounds, or words on a page that create the meaning of something that exists outside the sphere of language. And in this is the case, dog isn't just prescriptive in that it just means the four-legged animal that sometimes lives in your house. What it means is it points to a large collection or a large body of ideas and concepts and even metaphors surrounding dog. I mean, there is a lot of built-in meaning in the word dog. If you call someone a dog, it's an insult. It doesn't mean like something of high standing. But on the other hand, someone is working doggedly. That is a positive quality, and so you can see how the word dog is can be construed as infinite in meaning. And I can even further expound upon this. Dog as the word can mean many, many more things than just the animal. If someone says that, the code word to the secret operation is dog, and if I say dog in a sentence, that means that you are to attack the person in the room with us. Well, in that case, if I say, oh yeah, it looks like it's raining cats and dogs outside, the word that I have used, dog, is not even put there to refer to the metaphor of raining cats and dogs. It is a signifier to mean attack this man now. It's a word dog that has been removed and replaced with the meaning of attack the person in the room with me. And this is only possible through the situation that you find yourself in, or obviously, dog does not mean attack that man in every single instance of the word dog, but so too can you attach any kind of meaning to the signifier dog. You can come up with a million different versions of what this exactly entails. And this means that there not only are stories infinite, but stories about dogs are infinite. Just this one little noun, this one little thing, that you can tell an infinite amount of stories about the word dog or about dogs or about code name dogs. It expands off into infinity. And this is what I want to kind of explore is that I feel that a lot of DMs and some role players too kind of feel boxed in by cliche and kind of feel that they don't want to run a role playing campaign that is just something off of Critical Role or just a module or even like just Lord of the Rings, just Harry Potter redressed. And I'm here to say that, well, I guess my answer is two part in this concern. My answer is two part. First part is that you should never be worried about using cliches in work because they're cliches. You should worry about using cliches in cliche ways, as in, cliches are only given power when they exist, and this kind of harkens back to what I talked about. Cliches only exist as cliches if the environment around them within the work of writing is also a cliche. If you say, my passion burned like hot fire in a poem that you write your sweetheart, that is incredibly cliche. Not only because of the word use, my passion burned like hot fire, but also because the cliche, the word choice exists within a love poem. Now, you could use this string of words to mean something that is not cliche based on the surroundings that the words take place. This is like, meaning is difference. So if you said, like, my passion burns like hot fire, And you are not saying this in a situation where it would be cliche, you know, it becomes much more than a cliche. So don't try to think of cliches as bland minds or things to be avoided while DMing. Think of them as the tools that have been guaranteed to work in certain situations, but you can make work for you in surprising and amazing ways. No one faults the master architect for using a hammer. Hammers are good tools, and they are widely used in the carpentry industry. But it doesn't mean that if you use a hammer, you are somehow a less a worse carpenter than someone who, I don't know, uses some kind of strange tool or some tool that no other carpenter has used. It's not storytelling and DMing and or any kind of storytelling is much like carpentry in that the tools that we use to tell the story is in like a hero, um, a conflict, the setting. These are all tools that we have to use in order to tell a good story. And just like no one faults a carpenter for using a hammer, there is uh, um, a certain gauge of nail that's standard, when building a deck. And you can build a deck that is something different than anyone else's deck and use the same boards, the same nails, and the same material as someone who's built just a 10 by 10 platform. And this is kind of what I'm trying to get at with this really stretched out, terrible metaphor, is that it's not the materials that you use. It's not that, oh, you have elves and dwarves and like humans, and the dwarves live under the mountain and they're greedy, and the elves live in the forest and they're xenophobic, and the humans live in the plains and they're like pastoral, and they grow crops and they live in a feudal society. Just because you have these pieces, these raw materials, doesn't mean your story is immediately going to be bad or immediately going to be uninteresting. It's how you move these pieces that really makes your story cliche or not. And I think that is the nuance that a lot of new creators or new writers come in contact with, is they want to create something new, but they confuse what they should do, how to make newness. I have seen a lot of writers and a lot of creators try to come up with something new and name all the swords like Zindirs, and name all the race that lives in the forest, Garfalops, and the Garfalops use their crazy Zendirs to hack xiphoid folds into the towering monstrosities. And you're like, okay, all right, those are a lot of new words. But if the new words only signify things that are themselves cliche, then it doesn't matter how many new words. It doesn't matter if you come up with a race that's got like four legs, two arms, and only communicates through whistles and grunts. If they operate in cliche ways, as in the stories that you tell with this race fall into easily predictable or rutted storylines. That is what makes stories cliche. It's not the pieces. And in fact, you don't want to fall into the problem, which is called Tolkiening. And it's called Tolkiening because Tolkien, as an author, was the only one to actually succeed in it in a big way. Few other authors have been able to add words to the normal lexicon, but nothing like Tolkien. I think only next to Shakespeare has someone added more words into like the normal lexicon of our culture. And so like Tolkien, he came up with a bunch of new words. He came up with his own language. But in addition to coming up with all these new facets and new things, he also showed these pieces, which actually he took from either mythology of his own time or just generalizations of culture in the world. He was able to tell stories that were still engaging because the stories themselves were new. It didn't matter that he came up with new words or another language or crazy sounding names for things that already exist in the real world. It's because he was able to tell compelling stories with these new pieces. And that is really the bridge of creativity. It's not that you have a story that's never been told, or you have a an idea that no one else has had before. It's how you present your ideas and your stories that really cause people to sit up and take notice. And I want to say too that again, no carpenter has ever been faulted for building things out of wood like every other carpenter. As storytellers, we build things out of words. And every word that you come up with that people are able to understand has been said and understood in a different way and in a different context before. It does not mean that you are uncreative, nor does it mean that you are going to write a boring story. In fact, I've read quite some of my favorite stories use words that are simple to describe new things. If you have a race that builds weapons that very closely resemble swords, just call them swords. I see a lot of people also trying to use half tokening in that they just make up new nouns for things rather than new things themselves. Um, and again, since we are human, we're just pulling from history. And I guarantee that within the 3,000 years of recorded history, someone has come up with a melee weapon and a way to use it that you can come up with. But that doesn't mean that we're all uncreative and that we shouldn't create. It's actually a cause for celebration. Rather than think of elves and dwarves and humans as cliches to be avoided, think of them as well used tools to be further experimented with. Think of them as new building blocks or old building blocks that have proven to hold up stories to build your own new creations. Don't throw out the Legos because everyone builds shit out of Legos. Keep the Legos because they're easy to build incredible things with. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it also helps to be able to, as I said, identify what is truly cliche and what it happens when something is new. Because you can arrive at cliche in two different ways, from two different avenues. The first avenue is arriving at cliche through action, as in like through arriving at cliche through how your story or your narrative unfolds. And in that way, I mean like the beats happen in the same way. The story beats happen in the same way as a bunch of other stories. In fact, like if you were to sit down and like really like describe a cliche story, it would start with the hero starts in a village that's very almost too idealistic. It's destroyed by an evil power. The young boy maybe has some love interest in the city that is taken by the big evil. He spends the center part of the story getting better, making friends, learning how to use his abilities that he's always had and just didn't know how to awaken. He goes to the evil villain's lair who destroyed his village all those years ago, defeats him, saves the love interest. They go back and restart the pastoral village. That is cliche, and it doesn't matter what you call the people that the village, if they're human, if they're Garfunkels, if they're Faloops, doesn't matter. If their entire society is based on starfish and star alignments, their government is some strange amalgamation of like capitalism and feudal democracy, and none of that matters if your story follows those same rut lines. No world building, no amount of world building in the world will save you from a cliche story if you fall into that road of cliche. The second road of cliche that you can run into is like the cliche, um, um, like the cliche parts, and I suppose this sounds like um, like a contradiction there, but if you do use pieces that people have used in the past, like elves and dwarves. Do not use them in the ways that are expected, I suppose. Or at least you should try to subvert expectations with the pieces that you're using. Because while I can sit here and say, it doesn't matter what you're using, it's how you use it, in some ways you have to be careful about the tool that you are using. It is much, much easier to build a level 10 by 10 boring deck with wood and a hammer than it is to build like a work of art with the same tools. And this is kind of what I mean is that you don't want to be constricted by the ease of the story you're telling. If you're telling a story about elves that are xenophobic, put some effort into telling the how they're different from every other xenophobic elf race that's come before. And that's kind of your job using these pieces is to use them in a way that people haven't seen before. Not don't use any of them. Not if you use them you're uncreative. That's what I mean by two streets. You can use new things in a cliche way, and you can use cliche stuff in a cliche way. So it's not. Again, I'm circling back to this. It's not that the pieces you're using have been used by other pieces, other people, other creatives. In fact, everything that you use, as every word that you've spoken, has been spoken by another person. And if it hasn't, then no one is going to understand you. I can come up with a word right now that I guarantee no one has ever come up with. But if I say it, no one is going to understand what it is. If I explain what it is, why then I've used a word again, and I am repeating myself, and then someone else can go and use that word, but it's no longer new. It has become, once it gets into the dictionary and becomes a word, it is a cliche, and it's if a loose description of the word cliche. But so really, like circling back around, that's what I wanted to really hammer home here is that it's not that we as DMs are tasked with producing something that no one has seen before in a role playing game. We are tasked with taking the pieces that the people at Wizards of the Coast have given us and tell stories that are interesting with those pieces. So going off of that, since we did kind of miss I missed my last lecture on improv, I can dive into that a little bit and say stuff like, oh, hang on. Whoop. All right, and say stuff like, one of the best ways of improving without falling into cliche is to use what I talked about with Derrida and deconstruction, and instead of training yourself when thinking of something new or thinking of something off the spot, on the spot, trying to think of something new on the spot, rather than training yourself and we do this naturally. Cliches are cliche because it's the first thing everyone thinks of when you say like think of a dramatic ending and you give that to 100 people. There's going to be some similarities between a lot of them, and those are where cliches are born. So rather than training yourself or try to untrain yourself. So rather than when someone tells you like to think of a dramatic, oh my goodness, rather than tell someone to think of when someone tries to think of a dramatic story, rather than trying to fall into the ruts of cliche, try in that moment to think of anything other than a dramatic story, and then use your moments to weave those two things together. Try to come up with a way to incorporate two things that don't have a lot to do with each other into the thing that you've produced, or the thing that you've come up with. And it takes training, and it's not an easy thing, and I don't necessarily do it every time. There is some mental work involved, and running into cliches and falling into those ruts is easy, is very easy. So we wanna try to teach ourselves to be creative in those moments where it really counts. Because everyone can sit down for 6 hours and come up with something relatively new. Humans are naturally gifted in coming up with new things. But in terms of like real creativity, or I guess real improv creativity, it's really more important to do the bulk of the work automatically and to try to come up with those things off the top of your head. The moral of the story is that creativity is infinite. There are so many words, so many nouns, so many ideas that you can compare to each other and discover a new way of thinking about those things and words and ideas. And within that new discovery, an infinite amount of stories can be told. You can discover a universe of stories in between the difference between two things as small as like a banana and an ant. And this is a great power that a lot of people take for granted, or a lot of people don't necessarily understand. And I think that it's important to really understand that because creativity is infinite, there will be no end to stories. And because of that, and again, this isn't to say that there is, it's not some nihilistic perspective as if there's no good stories or no bad stories, or, every story told with a cliche is bad or anything like that. This is not a judgment, an artistic or aesthetic judgment at all. This is more to say that uh, that writer's block, or the inability to come up with something that feels new, is an illusion. And in that, something brand new, something that no one has ever thought of before, and something that is maybe wildly successful or wildly popular, may exist between the spaces of things that exist on your desk, may exist between the relationships between two ideas that you had, one in the morning and one at night. It is a an infinite well of possibility between just two ideas. If you add more than that, it becomes it becomes exponential. So I just really want to try to get that across, that creativity and things like writer's block, or things like saying I am an uncreative person, are are strengths or weaknesses that we can work on and that we can get better at. And that even in a era where we're creating more new information at a rate that is that far exceeds the entirety of human history, there is still new things to be discovered and new things to talk about and new stories to tell. And in that, these stories that haven't been told yet, and these famous fictional characters that don't exist yet, they do not exist in a place that no one has been before. They don't exist outside of cliche or outside of well-trodden story structure. They will follow those cliches. I mean, look at the most recent major franchise to really come out in the last 50 years, and that's like Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling became a billionaire through books. And the Harry Potter series are rife with cliche, in both like character setting and story structure. But that doesn't mean that they didn't sell. It doesn't mean that they're not bastions of incredible creativity. And it shows really the strength of the author when they're able to create something that people enjoy and read over and over again using these tools like I talked about. And it's just any one of us can be the next J.K. Rowling if we take the time and stop and practice relating things that don't necessarily belong together, to each other in ways that maybe people have done before, but it's the first time that you've ever done it.